I know she got herself in a lot of trouble.
She did. But part of what I think is interesting about Elizabeth Cady Stanton is she starts, early on, she has an evangelical conversion experience under Charles Finney. But part of it is, right, Charles Finney really, I mean this literally scares the hell out of her. She's terrified she's going to go to hell, and so she converts. And then she's just wallowing in grief, and she has friends and relatives who kind of try and walk her back from the ledge. And after that, she basically says, that can't be how God functions. Again, it's that sort of move, right? That seems immoral. God can't be that way. And then over the course of her life, she ends her life, I would say, outside of Christianity. I think she would say outside of Christianity. But part of what she does is to create something called the Woman's Bible, right? Where she goes through and takes passages that talk about women in the Bible and basically says, right, I'll take the first 2 chapters of Genesis. She says, Genesis 1 tells us accurate things about God. God created men and women together as images of God. Genesis 2, where God created man and then woman out of man's rib, that was a myth that somebody created who wanted to subordinate women. Okay? So again, there might be lots of good, valid reasons to say that, but again, it's just part of the world that we live in, that people can now look at the Bible and say, we can see how these stories came together, and they're not necessarily about God speaking to people or about how things really were. These may actually be stories that show us how interest groups worked. Right? And there was an interest group who wanted to make sure women stayed in their place, and so we have Genesis 2. That's a different view of the Bible. It may be right? But again, it's part of, when we think about how people think about religion and how people think about Christianity, that's part of the world we live in, right? The Bible is a book that you can treat like you would treat any other ancient text and say, we know where that came from, and it ain't great. Yeah.
Isn't that how it was, though, in medieval times? How everything revolved around the church? Wasn't it basically just them trying to keep people in their place until Martin Luther came around and said you can actually kind of see things in your own way?
There's at least some truth to that. I mean, I think I would put it a little bit more, I'm a historian, so this is my job. A little bit more sympathetically, sure, part of it was probably about control, but I think for some people there is really the belief that it doesn't make sense to say that you can have functioning societies where people believe different things about God. And if you think that's absurd, recognize that there are a lot of people in our country today who still say it. Right? This is, an actual real concern. How do you have functioning societies where people believe different things about God? And I will say this about Luther. Luther didn't actually change that. Right? Luther wanted people to have access to the Bible and all of that. But if you got something really different than Martin Luther, Luther was pretty ready to say that you were wrong. But he thought that your basis needed to be the Bible. But this raises the question we'll come back to then. Who gets to decide what the Bible says? Right? If today, right, I'm not Lutheran, but still, right, I recognize Martin Luther as part of my faith heritage. If I come up with a different interpretation of the Bible than Martin Luther, should I then say, I must be wrong? Or do I say, well, I'm actually a relatively intelligent individual, I can read the Bible for my own, and if I get something that both Calvin and Luther and Wesley and everybody else would say, well, that's just too bad. I'm an individual, I have sort of a brain, I get to decide. It gets to be a really complicated question. So Luther, I think, started something that has ended in a place Luther himself would not have gone, which is, the sort of, everybody's equally right. I don't think he thought that. All right.
Come back next week.
All right.